Steve Soretsky here, as always, Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Questions, comments, put those below. Every month, as always, there's the Soretsky report, which goes out again, a 30-page, give or take, in-depth review of the sort of Vancouver residential housing market. I highly encourage you to actually get on that report. So there's going to be a link below where you can check out the monthly report there. But if you actually read the report, on the bottom of every page there's a link where you can actually sign up for free for future issues of the monthly Soretsky report. The reason why I say now is an important time to actually jump on is we're actually going to revamp that report here for 2020, probably as early as next month, where we're going to basically be doing a really thorough deep dive. We're talking 40-50 pages of sort of Vancouver housing as it pertains to residential, commercial land, and pre-sale. So you have the whole sort of scope of what's happening in this Vancouver housing market, as well as some of the larger, more macro things that may pertain or impacts sort of Canadian housing policy changes, etc. So this is going to be a very in-depth report. Again, I should probably realistically be charging for it, particularly given the amount of money that I pay for subscription services that help influence this report. But it is really ultimately my way of giving back. So the goal, the plan, and the intention is for that report to stay free. Right now we're at about 7,000 subscribers. So if you want to get on that, again, I highly encourage you to do that. So check out the link in the comment section below. But this week I wanted to touch on something that is kind of fascinates me, because the whole purpose of this channel is really just having a dialogue about real estate and finance and really just overall sort of wealth generation, and just watching the financial landscape from sort of a distance and relating to how it may impact your sort of life. So I think one of the things that I find interesting is that people in Vancouver always like to relate Vancouver as a global city, and Manhattan is always the one that frequently comes up that we like to compare ourselves to. And I think certainly some of those comparisons are justified in terms of that it is a global housing market. There is a lot more outside influential demand, but there are some things that I think that are worth distinguishing. And one of the things that I actually find interesting is that, we talk about New York, saying, New York, Manhattan, basically saying that this is endless demand for this housing market, that, prices in New York can never go down, that there's always, you can't lose money. And I think there's a lot of falsehoods that, and people are always moving there. So if you look at the recent numbers, I just find it interesting to see what is happening there. New York, for population actually declined this year by 0.4%. So they lost about 76,000 people. So people are starting to leave the state of New York, and it's actually the fourth consecutive year where the population has shrunk in New York. And so I find that very interesting. I think there's obviously a lot of reasons for that. One of them is the changes to the local taxes, SALT, if you're not familiar with it in the US. A lot of it ultimately just comes down to the cost of living, where people basically at some point, if your cost to live there is so burdensome that at some point you basically just give up and say, okay, I got to look for greener pastures. So what you're starting to see in the US anyways, people are basically moving to the sort of southwest, sort of these hotter climates where there's very little state or almost no state income taxes in some instances, and there's a lot of people moving there and job growth, and it's very much affordable. And then you look at sort of New York, Manhattan, which has been sort of the creme de la creme for the past 2 decades, is now seeing population pull back again, 4 consecutive declines, but they're also building a ton of supply, and it kind of goes back to the old adage of supply and demand. If you don't want to sort of solve housing, one way to do that is to flood the market with new supply, and that's actually what New York is doing. As of a recent report came out that says they have just over 7,000 units available, unsold new homes available. And if that actually equates at the current sales pace to 6 years of supply, which is staggering. And so the analysts that put that report together basically suggested that prices have already come off about 10%, and they're going to have to fall further to get that market back in a balance. And so I think that kind of goes to show that, you know, there's no really such thing as invincible markets, and the old adage that, you know, you can't just necessarily extrapolate past performance. I find it interesting to see that, again, that New York market has been the creme de la creme, but it kind of begs the question that I have for Canadians and anyone that lives in, say, Vancouver or Toronto or anywhere else for that matter, is at what stage, at what point do people begin to sort of leave? At what point, like what is, I'm just generally curious, I'm not saying that there isn't a specific answer for this, and what is that threshold for people to leave the market? So let's just say hypothetically, you know, in Vancouver, you know, your average condo typically priced in downtown Vancouver, let's say, is $1,000 a square foot. If that was to get to like 1,100, 1,200, do people start to leave? Is it 13, 14, 15? Let's just say hypothetically, if you continue to get, you know, 5 or 6% price increases annually, compounded over the next 10 years, do you have condo prices at, say, $1,800 a square foot, and wages, let's say, really just continue to grow at 2 to 3%? At what point do people leave? It's the same thing for Toronto. We're still seeing massive price appreciation in Toronto condos. You know, when these things are launching at, say, $1,800 a square foot, new build, do these things hit 2,000, 22, 24, 28, 3,000? Let's just say Toronto condos hit $4,000 a square foot. Again, I don't think that's going to happen, but again, maybe it happens in 20, 30 years with massive inflation behind that, so the real gains are actually muted. But let's just say hypothetically they grow to that case. At what point does the population reverse and start to look for alternatives? I certainly think that it's probably reaching that threshold. But at the same time, I look at Canada and say, realistically, and this is one of the counter arguments, is there not really any great alternatives. So, like, okay, so if you're in New York and you say, okay, well, I want to move, I can't, you know, the cost of living, let's call a spade a spade. If you're not making $500,000 in New York, you're really not having probably the greatest standard of living. Like, it's almost like that's like the barrier to entry there. So let's just say you're like, okay, well, I'm done with this and I want to go. Well, I feel like in the US, you have so many alternatives with relatively strong job markets that you can basically migrate, you know, interstate with relative ease. So, you know, you can go from New York to, say, Boston, Texas, you know, to, say, Denver, Colorado. Nashville's booming. Phoenix, Arizona is one of the fastest growing states or cities. And so you have all these alternatives. You can go to Miami, Florida if you want. Now, again, no state income tax. So it feels like there's so many alternatives in the U.S., whereas if we come to Canada, let's just call it what it is. I mean, okay, you have Vancouver is really nice. Toronto is, you know, quite nice in terms of, like, you have to also factor in not just, like, okay, how nice it is, but, like, the actual job prospects. So, like, yeah, sure, it's nice to say I'm going to go live up north, but, like, what are you sacrificing? You're probably sacrificing substantial job opportunities. And so what we're seeing is basically all the population growth continues to sort of funnel in where the jobs are and where these large metros are, which is Vancouver, Toronto, used to be sort of Calgary, but that's, you're actually still seeing quite strong population growth in Calgary despite the weakness in the economy. But the alternatives outside of that, I mean, Saskatchewan, you know, Moncton, New Brunswick, Newfoundland, I mean, Manitoba. To be honest, the alternatives in Canada outside of sort of Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, and again, in Montreal, you have to be bilingual, Ottawa, Calgary. Those are the options I just find are much less. And people can talk about Victoria, but again, Victoria is more of this downsizing scenario where realistically the cost of living is still pretty elevated and the job prospects simply aren't as great as a real large metro. So I think that's one of the things that I'm watching for. But to sort of summarize all that and to bring it all back to sort of the Manhattan process, what I'm kind of curious to see where the prices grow and to see at what point what is the critical threshold for people to then start outflowing, or to see a substantial reduction in the population growth into these core cities if there's simply not enough housing. The good thing is I think that we are trying to build to keep up with that. We can see also massive housing starts in Toronto, but in Vancouver, despite all the media headlines about new policy intervention, dampening future development, etc., is housing starts in 2019 for the entire year hit an all-time high. So here's a chart on housing starts annualized in the metro city of Vancouver. As you can see, is housing starts hit all-time highs, surpassing our previous record in 2016. So we still have a full pipeline there. You also still have, that doesn't include the units under construction, which is 45,000 units under construction. So the pipeline, the product new supply coming to Vancouver is certainly a lot. Again, that's going to complete over the next couple of years. But we are definitely seeing, and this is what I talk about in the latest edition of the Soretsky Report, is you're seeing developers start to pull back in terms of launching new units at the pre-sale centers. And so here's a chart basically showing, what you can see is the monthly releases of pre-sale projects along with the 12-month moving average. And basically what you're seeing is developers are really starting to pull back the number of launches for pre-sales. Again, we talked about this before, but there's been almost virtually no high-rise concrete product launched this year. We should see about 3,000, 4,000 high-rise concrete units launched this year. Normally you'd see between 8 to 12,000. So I think that future supply, 4 to 5 years out is going to pull back as a result of what the developers are doing today. But the reality is the new supply is still coming. And if you want to do that, I think ultimately the government needs to really get out of the way if you want to do what a Manhattan is doing, which is flood the market with supply. If your ultimate goal is, say, lower prices, one way to do that is just to flood the market with supply. And I think that ultimately the government here is getting in the way. It's funny because I was talking to an architect here and he's saying, well, they're actually about to release the new building code in the city in Vancouver, and it's just gonna add to even more labor costs. The cost of building a home, the fact that it costs basically about $300 a square foot to build, say, a single family house in Vancouver is ridiculous. I mean, you're talking about $700,000, $800,000 to build a single family house alone. So even if somebody gave you the land for free, let's say you got the land for free, it's still that a single family house is still going to cost brand new $700,000, $800,000 just because of the cost of the materials, the labors, and more importantly is the government regulations, all the building permits they make you go through, all the building code that they make you follow. It's government that really needs to get out of the way as well. So I think that's something that I'm kind of watching on. This is probably a little bit of a different video than we normally talk about in terms of finance, but I think it's just kind of interesting to have that debate, to understand sort of population growth, employment growth, what makes people tick. I mean, realistically, it's interesting to see the last chart I'll leave you with here. This is employment growth by province across Canada. What we can see is clearly Ontario is the leader, which was why we can probably see the record amounts of population growth and the record amount of new home construction. But in BC, I mean, employment growth is 0.3%. Nothing to write home about at all. So kind of curious to see where that moves us moving forward into 2020 for that future outlook. So hope that video helped. Otherwise, see you next week.